every American, but especially myself as an African American. And so I'm so proud, so happy, and I'm ready to go to work for him and to make America better.
Now, I know that you focus a lot on businesses in the inner cities, places that are hurting the most right now with this economic downturn. What are you expecting from him as a president to deliver in terms of inner cities, areas where your theaters are built?
Well, let me just say, first of all, he got to just get the whole general economy going, not just the inner city, but the economy as a whole. And I would hope that he would just put people to work in urban America because we need jobs. And we also, if you create new opportunities, new businesses in urban America, then that will create the jobs that is missing in our community.
And then lastly, just as a basketball player, I have to ask if you and the hoopster-in-chief, soon-to-be, have ever played basketball, or if you have any plans to do so at the White House court that he plans on assembling where the bowling alley now is.
Well, President Obama said he's going to change the bowling alley to a basketball court. And if I get that invitation, I will be there, and we will throw some elbows at each other and play some hoop and just have fun. And it would be my honor, my pleasure to go and play basketball with him. And I'm sure Michael Jordan and Larry Bird, everybody else would love it too.
You have to take it easy on him a little bit, though, right? I mean, you're a big guy. I mean, you're not going to hurt. You're not going to foul him.
I would only take it easy if he take it easy on my taxes.
So there you go. There's the quid pro quo for President-elect Obama. Take it easy in the court in exchange for some action on the tax relief. Back to you, Charlie.
I think he's going to take them up on it. I was talking to the president-elect during the campaign, and he was actually hoping to play with Larry Bird during his debate prep, and it had to get canceled. So I'll bet you Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, they're going to get that invitation to the White House.
Oh, that's terrific. And I've actually thought of this in the past. Watching the campaign, Barack Obama has a terrifically infectious smile. And I'm not sure that the only person with a more infectious smile in the country is not Magic Johnson. It is extraordinary. By the way, we understand that Pope Benedict XVI sent a telegram to the new president. My prayers that Almighty God will grant you unfailing wisdom and strength in the exercise of your high responsibilities. That a telegram from the Pope to Barack Obama.
And your former weather girl weighing in here? If people are starting to look warmer, they're not. It's 23 degrees out there, but feels like 10 degrees with a wind chill.
We're going to take a commercial break. Our coverage of this 56th inaugural of a President of the United States will continue.
We are one nation. We are one people. And our time for change has come.
ABC News live coverage of Inauguration 2009 continues after this message and a word from our ABC stations. ABC's Inauguration 2009 is on VCast. Get all-day continuous coverage of this historic American event from ABC News. VCast, only from Verizon Wireless.
Hey, we're the Calorios. That's my wife Frances, it's Bobby Jr. That's my best friend Gary. He's like a brother to me. That's my brother Richie. He's more like a cousin. Uncle Ray. He's not my real uncle, but he doesn't owe me money, so he's a keeper. So can I call him?
As much as you want.
Call more people? Use 0 minutes with Verizon Wireless. Now America's largest mobile-to-mobile calling family. Over 80 million strong. And right now get great messaging phones on sale, like the NV2 for $49.99 at Verizon Wireless.
Here's positively the best place to start your day. Here's where your night lights up in the most unexpected ways. Here's where the newsmakers make news on Sunday mornings. Here's where you see real-life drama clearly with 20/20 vision. And here is where the world comes home to you.
Best Buy salutes Inauguration 2009.
I remember this lady, she wanted to surprise her husband because he's a big, huge football fan, to make up for the fact that he made the ultimate sacrifice. He had to sell his season tickets in order to pay for the wedding. She wanted to give him the experience of being at the game at home. As I was showing her this stuff, she was like, oh my God, he's gonna love this. She got like a 60-inch. It was a nice 60-inch shoe. I could imagine him just walking in and all of a sudden you turn, you just see this huge screen. 2 weeks later, they came back and he was just like, thank you. Just another love story at Best Buy with the 60-inch TV in the middle.
Tomorrow, beginning at 5 a.m.
After the celebration, it's time to get to work. Eyewitness News is live at the Capitol with President Obama's first full day on the job.
Join Lori, Ken Rosano, and Bill Evans with the AccuWeather forecast. Tomorrow on Eyewitness News this morning at 5 a.m. right here on ABC 7.
Join Eyewitness News anchor Bill Ritter on Twitter live at Barack's inauguration.
This is your victory.
Be an eyewitness to history. Go to 7online.com for details. At Channel 7 Eyewitness News, we treat severe weather and breaking news the same way.
We'd have some strong storms coming into the area.
So when weather is the big story, you can count on the AccuWeather team to keep you on top of a storm's every move.
A thunderstorm warning has been issued for the area.
Lee Goldberg, Bill Evans, Heidi Jones, and Jeff Smith. Watch and see how they nail the most accurate forecasts when it matters most.
Once again, in the AccuWeather forecast.
When breaking news is severe weather, stay with the weather team you trust. Only on Channel 7 Eyewitness News.
Watch inauguration coverage streaming live on 7online.com.
Of past ceremonies there in front of the White House as the incoming and outgoing presidents have left together. You saw Eisenhower and Kennedy. There, Reagan with Bush. Clinton with Bush 41. Bush 43. Clinton, I hate using just the last name, put president in front of each one of those names because it's disrespectful not to do so. And there is the north portico of the White House as we wait for the president-elect, Barack Obama, who an hour and a half from now will be president of the United States, and George Bush about to depart. And there you see the reviewing stand where the president will watch, then President Obama will watch the inaugural parade a couple of hours from now. There is also across the street a giant stand that has been built for the press. It's interesting, they've been building this reviewing stand for Barack Obama since before Thanksgiving. And I sort of wondered, you know, if you're the president and you're sitting in the White House and you're watching them for months build this thing in front of the White House for your successor, it's just a little bit, I don't know how you'd feel about it. Hey, I'm still here yet. You know, I haven't left yet.
Helps you get used to it.
I'm still here.
All right, you could pull those curtains.
I guess, but you hear the bang, bang, bang of the hammers and the saws and whatever. And there are the people who are already gathered on the podium. Mayor Bloomberg of New York is there. They're already there in place for the inaugural ceremonies.
What about 1,600 people up on the platform, another 1,000 in the bleachers behind the platform.
And then many people arrayed in front who are ticket holders. Each member of Congress gets a number of tickets. Each member of the Senate gets 393, if my memory is correct. Each member of the House gets 190-some, 198, I think is the proper number. And they have been besieged by applications. Many of the members of the House and Senate had lotteries for their tickets. I remember reading of one member of the Senate who had 40,000 requests for 400 tickets, held a lottery. A couple of members decided that they just couldn't decide anything fairly, and so they gave their tickets to various charitable organizations that were in their districts. Everywhere you go, by the way, in the city of Washington, there you see somebody wearing a button and a hat. Everywhere you go, there are inauguration and Obama tchotchkes for sale. One of the best, Lee Camlett, one of the writers for World News, picked up a bar of soap. And it was labeled The Audacity of Soap. A play on the audacity of hope, Barack Obama's book.
Even doing limited editions of bobbleheads, so that shows you how far it's gone. But George,
I wonder if they were really limited editions.
That's right. You have a report on what was said to the president-elect in church.
That's right. At St. John's Church this morning, the pastor was T.D. Jakes of Dallas, and he took his lesson from Daniel 3:19, and he had 4 lessons for the president-elect. He said, number 1, in time of crisis, good men must stand up. God always sends the best of men into the worst times. 2, you cannot change what you will not confront. 3, you cannot enjoy the light without enduring the heat. And finally, extraordinary times require extraordinary methods, but he didn't stop there. He then went on to quote his 14-year-old son, who said he would want to talk to you about Star Wars. He said Star Trek, but he meant Star Wars, and he finished by saying, may the Force be with you.
Trekkie salute from everybody there. Of course, they also played the hymn that Franklin Delano Roosevelt first made a tradition, "Oh God, our help in ages past."
Robin Roberts, our pal from Good Morning America, is down in the ticketed section down there. And Robin, I understand you also have a guest that I think most people will recognize.
I ran into a pair of friends. It's good to see you, Charlie, George, and Diana. Diana, it took me an hour and a half to make my way from our location this morning. Got so hot, I had to just get rid of the gloves. It's hot out here right now. But Spike Lee is here, his beautiful wife, Tanya Lee Lewis. Said you promised the sun would come out, didn't you?
I did. I told Spike the sun was going to shine today. It's been cloudy for the last 3 days, but it's beautiful out here today.
It is gorgeous. And what does this day mean to you, Spike?
It means a lot, you know. I'm warming up now because it's freezing out here, and we had to do a little walk, but it's nothing compared to the many years, hundreds of years, you know, it took to get to this point in history for this country.
A lot of people said they didn't mind being out in the cold. They didn't mind walking because they said it was reminding them of their ancestors. Blacks and whites were saying it was reminding them of those who fought for civil rights, who went through much worse than the crowd that we see today in the cold weather that we're bearing.
Yeah, this is a celebration, and I'm just glad to be here. Yeah. Glad to be here.
And they walked along with us as we were walking in. I swear I felt their presence.
Did you pick out that hat for him?
No. He did that on his own. Don't blame me on that one.
Robin? That's my Yankee joint. What's this Yankee winter joint right here?
It is a Yankees hat, he's saying, Charlie.
Robin,
Yes,
Robin,
yes,
I can see the New York Yankee logo on that hat. I've seen Yankee hats in many different hues, but never with ear flaps and that kind of fur.
Yeah, Charlie said he's never seen quite a Yankees hat like that, but he's wearing it well, and he's wearing it proud. But there's so many people that were running through here in the crowd. I ran into a classmate of my mom's, 1946, Howard University. You know, my mom is somewhere in the masses, and I ran into a classmate of hers here, and it's just that wonderful feeling. You keep running into so many different people. But I know you all want to get to your seats, enjoy the day.
And then just yesterday being Dr. King's birthday, the national holiday, and the next day, when we've had 2 days like this back to back in the history of our country? I don't think so, ever.
We're still not going to forget that hat, though, even though you said that.
I can guarantee you, Robin, we're never going to see Derek Jeter or Alex Rodriguez or Mark Teixeira in that hat. It's just not going to happen.
A-Rod's not going to be caught in that. Y'all, thank you. Thanks so much.
Right.
Back to you guys. Thanks, Spike.
All right,
Enjoy.
Robin Roberts and Spike Lee, thanks very much. Going to go to, oh, there it is, November 4th, 2008. That's Election Day. Interesting, mission accomplished. There's a number of levels that you can look at that sign. Let's go to Deborah Roberts, who is in the middle of the mall among the crowds. Deborah?
Hi, Charlie. And you would never guess that these folks are probably about a half a mile away from the swearing-in point. The two words that I can use to describe these folks is iron will. Some of them said they came out this morning at 12:30, braving single or at least 16-degree temperatures probably. And I think the one thing, Charlie, that seems to be getting them through it, besides the determination, hand warmers. Everybody around here talks about the hand warmers. Warmers, but they are so excited. You talked before about how well behaved they are. Some of them talked about the obstacles they faced when we tried to get here through the wee hours of the morning. All the security checkpoints, right? Yes. They all talked. Lots that were closed. This lady said she had to walk 2 miles just to get to the metro, but they wouldn't dream of turning around, Charlie. They are so excited to be here at this point, even though they're not necessarily close to the swearing-in point, but they're right here next to these jumbotrons. And I tell you, I've never seen spirit like this before.
We love it.
They love it. They love it. All over the country, Charlie. From California, from Florida, from Virginia, from North Carolina. I mean, it's amazing. And it's like a big pep rally out here. They're ready.
All right.
A few minutes ago, they had a chant going, get fired up, get fired up. I don't think they're cold at all. Everybody seems to be quite warm at this moment.
No, I was walking out of the hotel this morning with somebody who was talking about her extra pair of socks and her extra pair of gloves that she was bringing with us, and her friend said, I don't think you're going to need it. We're going to be so huddled close together that we'll give each other warmth, and indeed that seems to be exactly what's happening down there.
We definitely are. Every place I move, my crowd moves with me, Charlie. We love you.
All right, Deborah, thanks very much.
I couldn't believe the people coming in this morning when I came in at 3:30. And a number of them, of course, said they were fearless about the cold. One of them said, history is going to keep me warm.
We're going to see, there are already, though we're waiting for President-elect Obama and President Bush to come out of the White House, and this is not them, but we are waiting for them. There are already people arriving at the Capitol for all of this, and Ted Kennedy there you saw at the Capitol for the inauguration, and there is Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California, who is head of the Congressional Inauguration Committee. And Senator Bennett from Utah, who is the ranking Republican on the Inauguration Committee. There are actually 3 inauguration committees. There's the Congressional Inauguration Committee, handles everything that happens at the Capitol. The Presidential Inauguration Committee that handles all that which is not at the Capitol. And then there's an Armed Forces Inauguration Committee which handles all of the military involvement in all aspects of the inauguration today. And there you can, that's actually an interesting shot. You can see straight through the White House, back out through the South portico and onto the South Lawn, and you can't make out the Washington Monument in the background, but that is the view. This is Jill Biden, Dr. Jill Biden, and Lynn Cheney, the wife of Vice President Cheney.
They are 2 scholars.
Both of them. And interestingly, we understand that Vice President Cheney pulled a muscle in his back as he was lifting boxes to move out of the Vice President's mansion into their new home, which is their home in Arlington, where they will move. And so I understand he may be in a wheelchair today for the ceremony.
It's interesting to see the silhouettes. They too seem to speak of an unknown future. Thinking of the 2 of them walking out. Wasn't it John Adams who said he thought he heard George Washington say, 2 of us walking out, 1 coming in, 1 leaving, who's happier?
That would have been pre-White House, though.
Yes, pre-White.
White House dating, well, it was built during the John Adams administration.
And a little later in the year.
A little later in the year. What do you mean?
March.
Oh, well, the inaugurations used to be in March, yes. That's an interesting point. The Constitution simply outlines the oath that the president will take, but it does not say anything about when or where the inauguration will take place. There's First Lady to be, departing First Lady, leaving her home of the past 8 years. But for many, many years, the inaugurations took place in March 4th. And the 20th Amendment to the Constitution moved that up to January 20th because the transitions were just taking too long.
They also calculated, consulting whatever weather calculations they had at the time, that it was unseasonably warm often at that time of the year. May want to revise that.
But Franklin Roosevelt, I believe his second inauguration was the first that took place on January 20th. So the First Ladies are on their way.
What is it, about a 12-minute trip from the White House to the Capitol?
It looks like, yeah, there he is, Senator Ted Kennedy. And indeed he is in a wheelchair today because of that pulled muscle in his back.
I'm sure this proud man did not want to
do that, right?
In a wheelchair.
sir.
Good morning. Chilly, huh?
Have them go around.
I've been curious about the limousines. I don't know why you get caught up in minutia about all this, but my suspicion had been that they would ride down to the inauguration in President Bush's limousine, and as Peter Thomas showed us the other night on World News, there's a brand new 6-foot tall, most secure ever limousine for the Obamas, and I don't know if they'll use that going down. If I were President Bush, I'd sort of like to see the new car that the new guy got, but I don't know which limousine they're going to use.
There must be a protocol on that, though.
Probably is. There's a protocol on everything else.
Yes, it supposedly has all sorts of new technology inside it. The president-elect's new car, which they call the Beast because it's so big and tall. The doors, we've got reinforced titanium in the doors. Apparently, they weigh as much as a jetliner's door.
And my wife asked, how many miles a gallon do you think they're going to get with that car? I wondered if they I suppose they bought it in cash. I guess they don't buy 36 payments or whatever.
Actually, these days, the U.S. government isn't buying anything with cash.
Probably true.
It is a beautiful
And there is, that's the president-elect coming out. And we can, from here, hear the cheers along Pennsylvania Avenue as people are watching this on television screens. And a little piece of small minutia. The president usually sits in the back on the passenger side, and Barack Obama sat on that side going over to church, but now he takes the other side, and President Bush still has the president's seat in the car.
I hope I'm right. I believe that's President Bush's car because it has the seal on the side. I don't think the president-elect's car this morning had the seal on it.
No, he doesn't get the flags and the presidential flag on the car or the seal until he actually has been sworn in. So they make their way now down Pennsylvania Avenue. They'll go right by here in our vantage point at the museum overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue. This is actually, as Diane mentioned, a relatively quick ride. They come back. Barack and Obama and Michelle Obama will come back at a very slow pace as they make their way along Pennsylvania Avenue, but they'll go down at a pretty good clip.
Interesting to remember as they head out. The average age of the new president is 55 years old. The oldest was Ronald Reagan, 69. The youngest was Teddy Roosevelt at 42.
He's the 5th youngest president to be inaugurated. You get extra points if you can name all 4. I'll bet you can, Richard Norton Smith, our presidential historian. The 4 younger than Obama? This is a quiz for you. Are you with us, Richard Norton Smith?
He's Googling.
I think Franklin Pierce was one of them. I think
no.
U.S. Grant?
It was Grant was one.
Grant is one.
Right. Bill Clinton.
That's right. Well, John F. Kennedy.
And John F. Kennedy, that's right. You got it.
Okay.
Richard.
And Roosevelt.
Hey, by the way,
and Roosevelt.
You know one reason why they changed the Constitution to make this January 20th instead of March 4th, it was because of this ride and what went before it in 1933. The Hoover-Roosevelt relationship was so bad and the interregnum was so dire that they decided we don't ever want to put the country through this again. And so 1933 was the last day when this took place on January 20th, and that 12 minutes seemed like an eternity to those 2 men in that car.
And I think, Richard, they had absolutely no contact at all during that period, did they, the two of them?
Well, you know, the funny thing was, years earlier, they'd been friends. And in fact, in 1920, Roosevelt wanted Hoover to run for president as a Democrat. So they had actually had a relationship which soured, of course, when they ran against each other. A couple times during the interregnum, they actually got together. It did not go well. Franklin Roosevelt understood that his legitimacy at the depths of the Depression depended in part on separating himself from Herbert Hoover, who, fairly or not, had become personified with that period of national despair.
But Richard, do I read it correctly that this is no longer a moment for great, profound advice? By and large, these conversations have been about incidentals. They have been about the moment, looking out the window.
Yeah, this is, you said earlier, Diane, what a human pageant this is today. And we should never forget that these are human beings who are going through the most extraordinary transition imaginable in front of the eyes of the world. And most of the time, it's very friendly. They rise to the occasion. Sometimes it can be a rather frosty ride down the avenue. That was certainly the case with, as you said earlier, Dwight Eisenhower, Harry Truman. They almost got into an argument over who had authorized, ordered John Eisenhower, the president's son, home from Korea. Ike didn't know that he was coming. Harry Truman snapped that his president ordered him because he thought he should be here to see his father sworn into office. But most of the time, even when these are two people who've run against each other, they do rise to the occasion. And one good example of that was in 1981 when Jimmy Carter, bone weary, up all night trying to free the Iranian hostages, as we all remember, from their captivity in Tehran, rode down the avenue with Ronald Reagan. And Reagan actually had given orders that if the hostages were released, even in the middle of his inaugural address, he was to be notified so that he could invite now former President Carter to come forward and be acknowledged for those efforts.
Yes, and the Iranians denied Carter that. It was all timed so that it wouldn't happen on his presidency. It was really sort of the ultimate snub, and Ronald Reagan very graciously, as I recall, sent Carter over to greet the released hostages.
That's right.
One of the strangest facts I read poring over this moment in a motorcade was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a taxi apparently mistakenly got in the motorcade. And you saw the motorcade coming down with a very distressed taxi driver in the middle of it, unable to get out.
To satisfy my little piece of minutia here, this is apparently the Obama car. This is the new limousine that Barack Obama will have, taken apart by the Secret Service piece by piece to ensure that there are no bugging devices in it, then reassembled. And eventually there will be a fleet of 4 of these. Whenever the president travels, one of these gets flown overseas, and they use these cars wherever he may be.
So the seal has recently been placed on it.
Yeah.
They're going at a pretty good clip down Pennsylvania.
They are. And that shot you can see, there's a wide shot of Pennsylvania Avenue as this motorcade proceeds to the Capitol. When they arrive, the 2 presidents, the outgoing and the president-elect, are put in a holding room for some period of time while everyone gets arranged on the podium. We have actually a minute-by-minute tick-tock, essentially, as to how this all proceeds. The Supreme Court now down at the Capitol, arriving as we speak. Cabinet designees being announced and seated on the podium. The Senate will go into session this afternoon after the luncheon, which follows this, which follows the inauguration. There is a luncheon attended by the new president. He will, Barack Obama will take George Bush down to the helicopter. George Bush will depart for Texas, actually go out to Andrews Air Force Base, and then fly from Andrews Air Force Base for the last time on that plane, which is not called Air Force One because President Bush is no longer president. So it's not called Air Force One as it takes him back to Texas. It's called Special Air Mission 2800. They're going by us right now, actually, here. We get a chance to look out and see them. But after that, after he escorts President Bush out to the East Front and he leaves for Texas, he goes in, has a luncheon. And after that luncheon, the Senate will go in session today, and the Senate will actually confirm the nominations of 6 or 7 of his cabinet appointees. One that they sort of expected would be confirmed today, Hillary Clinton, but that's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. Senator John Cornyn of Texas, Charlie, is going to object to having that voted on today. He still has some concerns about the Clinton Foundation. He wants some more disclosure, more transparency. All this means in practice is that this will be held over for a day. He can hold it up for a day, but they will then have a roll call vote tomorrow, and Senator Clinton is likely to be confirmed by an overwhelming margin. Only one vote against her in the committee.
But there will be a number of cabinet appointees actually approved today, including Janet Napolitano, who will be the new Secretary of Homeland Security. There's one cabinet member, as I think everybody knows, being held over, Robert Gates, who's the Secretary of Defense. And he's actually not attending the ceremonies today, just for this continuity of government. Everybody is there in case anything catastrophic were to happen. He is there to maintain the continuity of government. He's at a U.S. military installation outside Washington. And there's one other cabinet member who gets held over for just one day, and that is the Director of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, and he basically stays in place for 24 hours just to oversee the security operation for the inauguration.
And we've been talking so much about security today, Charlie. The Department of Homeland Security did put out a bulletin last night about a potential threat from some terrorists based in Somalia. They put out a bulletin from the DHS and the FBI. They say it's of limited specificity and uncertain credibility, but they were concerned about this group in Somalia.
Even while Washington celebrates, there is security to worry about worldwide.
I keep thinking back, it has been 2 years coming up in February since Barack Obama in Springfield announced that he was going to run for president, saying he supposed it was a certain measure of audacity in his decision to do so. Saying, too, he thought that Abraham Lincoln would see the irony in the man who had won the Senate seat that he lost, walking up onto that podium today to be inaugurated.
And when he walks up to that podium, he will put his hand on the same Bible that Abraham Lincoln used in 1861. First president to do so since then.
I remember talking about the long campaign that he went through. The last time I had a chance to interview him and making small talk afterwards, I said to him, what's the one thing about campaigning now that you're elected that you miss the least? And he said, packing. Packing and unpacking. I hate suitcases, he said. And I said, you got one blue blazer that just works for everything? And he said, yep.
Well, you know, also for at least 4 years, he's not going to have to pack himself once.
That's exactly right.
You know, I did notice the difference last week when I spoke with the president-elect from the campaign. He was a much less harried, much more rested person. And just think about it. He's had the chance, because he's obviously was away from his family so much during the campaign for the last couple of months. For the first time in those 2 years, he's been able to live with his family, sleep at home every night.
You see him there pulling in over the security barricades in front of the Capitol, coming up in the East Front, on the opposite side of the Capitol from where he will be inaugurated. George and I were both remarking, Diane, and I think it's true. There's just something, this city is so majestic every day, and it does give you chills, but there's something about this day when the buildings look a little brighter. It just looks, it's beautiful.
Yes, the Capitol sitting there, the designer of Washington said that this hill was a pedestal waiting for a monument. It has its monument.
I grew up in the city, and it was a privilege to do so. And this is particularly when there is a change in parties, when one party is ceding power to the other. There is also a majesty to this day, and as I said, this day being the hallmark of the democracy.
Inside...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and inside, there is a presidential room.
He will go there right after the inauguration and sign whatever executive orders he needs to sign, most of which involve those who will have control of the various cabinet departments until the people can be...
Basic housekeeping just to get the government up and running.
But those are his first official acts as president, and if there are any executive orders to be signed, he will do it then. But I gather nothing significant to be done today, George?
From the transition aides, that no major policy executive orders today, but expect a lot of work the rest of this week, starting tomorrow on Iraq, on Guantanamo, and of course on the economy.
There are some who had anticipated perhaps he would sign an executive order today expanding federal involvement in stem cell research, rescinding, in effect, the Bush administration orders, but that's apparently not going to happen.
It's still in the works, but we're told not today.
Right. It is relatively, once we begin the ceremony for the inauguration, it's a relatively simple ceremony. There are a number of musical contributions. Aretha Franklin is going to sing My Country 'Tis of Thee. There's a magnificent quartet which will involve Yo-Yo Ma and Itzhak Perlman playing an original composition by John Williams, who has won so many Oscars, been nominated for so many Oscars. He won't conduct, but he will be there to hear his composition played, and it's an air on "'Tis a Gift to Be Simple," the great Shaker hymn that is part of Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring. Here's the mayor.
Reagan, New Orleans.
By the way, Yo-Yo Ma has a special carbon fiber cello because his 200-year-old cello can't withstand the cold.
Right. There is Craig Robinson, Michelle Obama's brother.
The Honorable John G. Roberts, Jr. and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court.
And you can hear the announcer there at the Capitol introducing the members of the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice, as is traditional, will swear in the President. Justice Stevens, the most senior member of the court, now I believe 88 years old, will swear in Vice President, soon to be Vice President Biden. I had thought, since my memory is shaky, I had thought that a member of the Supreme Court always swore in the Vice President, but it was the Speaker of the House who swore in Cheney 4 years ago, Dick Cheney. Personal friends have done it. Members of Congress have sworn in the Vice President. And are those members of the Supreme Court wearing earmuffs?
Justice Breyer was, yes.
We pointed out that Senator Obama was one of, 22 Democratic senators not to vote for the confirmation of
Chief Justice Roberts. That's right.
That's right. He
both Senator Biden and Senator Obama voted against his confirmation.
Overarching philosophy was his reason.
I believe he will be the first president to be sworn in by a Chief Justice who he voted against.
But there have been a number of times when there were sort of testy relationships. Justice Rehnquist, when he swore in President Clinton, he had just issued a decision in the Paula Jones case, which eventually led to the impeachment proceedings against him. And Chief Justice Taney swore in Abraham Lincoln, and they did not. He'd been in Chief Justice for 25 years or so and did not agree with Abraham Lincoln on the subject of emancipation and swore him in. It was not a good relationship they had.
Of course, that's retired Justice Sandra Day O'Connor.
Justice Rehnquist, 4 years ago, swore in George Bush, got out of a sickbed to get there, and just months later passed away. They seem to be running just a little bit behind. If they were on schedule, according to my TikTok, they would be introducing the former president, George H.W. Bush, and Mrs. Bush.
And we hear that the president-elect's speech will be about 15 to 20 minutes. I think that's about average for a presidential speech. The longest we all know was almost 2 hours. William Henry Harrison. The shortest, perhaps, George Washington, about a minute for 135 words.
Which is essentially, let's get back to work.
And you know, when we were talking to transition aides about this speech, they said, and usually you try to lower expectations a little bit for the speech, and certainly that's what President-elect Obama was trying to do, but they were telling us yesterday that when he finally bore down on it last weekend, it came very easily. to him, that he had no writer's block, no trouble at all in that final weekend.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect's cabinet and agency designees.
Well, I think that's an important point. First of all, expectations are so high for this speech. They are enormously high because of, A, the time. There's Leon Panetta, who was a former White House chief of staff under President Clinton, former congressman from California, designate CIA director.
Thank you.
And because so much of Barack Obama's political career has been based on his speeches. From that speech he gave to the Democratic Convention back in 2004 through his Susan Rice, who will be the UN ambassador.
But he is a writer, and he looks at himself as a writer. He wrote the 2 books, both of which sell so well still, and wrote them himself, and we understand this speech is his.
Largely. He had a lot of help from his speechwriter, Jon Favreau, who wrote one draft that was delivered in December, another one in January, but he took it over last weekend, and as they say, every word is his. They also consulted with some historians like David McCullough, who of course wrote the biographies of Harry Truman and John Adams, Doris Kearns Goodwin and Richard Goodwin. They consulted with them as well, but they do emphasize this is Barack Obama's speech first and foremost.
Michael Waldman is with us, who has had a hand in a lot of speech writing for presidents himself. And Michael, as we were talking about the expectations of all of this, I don't remember expectations ever being so high for an inaugural address, do you?
No, these speeches often are not that good and certainly are not well remembered, but Barack Obama has shown in a way that the kind of speech that he's so good at giving is like an inaugural address. He's wonderful at summoning the country's history and ideals, and what we know, unfortunately, is that when there's a crisis, the words matter a lot more, and so he has a chance to try to turn the country's mood around with a speech like this and give it a positive sense of momentum. And in a few short minutes, he's going to try to do that.
It's interesting. I went back, as I suppose many people in our business did, and read a lot of the previous inaugural addresses, and I was very struck, Michael, by some parallels to Ronald Reagan's, strangely enough, first inaugural address, when he talked about the economy being in such terrible trouble, and how we could bring ourselves out of a very difficult economic situation. But then, of course, he went in a totally different direction and said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. And I think you may hear some very similar themes from Barack Obama today, but then going in a different direction than did Ronald Reagan back in 1981.
Well, you're exactly right. Reagan summoned the plucky individualism of individual Americans, and he said government is not the solution, government is the problem. And that speech and that very clear, almost ideological declaration marked the beginning of decades, in effect, of conservative dominance over American political life. Now, with the economy in crisis and already the rescue plan for the banks and the stimulus in the works, it's very hard to see government as the problem necessarily, and probably President Obama, when he takes the oath, will have a chance to put a new explanation on the role of government, in effect, to debate over the years with Ronald Reagan.
It's funny you brought up that line, and Michael, you of course worked on the 1996 inaugural, where Bill Clinton answered that line from Ronald Reagan and said, government is not the problem, government is not the solution, we are the solution. And one of the things to watch for, I think, today is, as you're talking about, how does Barack Obama discuss the role of government, and does he enter that conversation with Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton directly?
You know, these presidents, they talked about Richard Nixon talking to the portraits in his last days in the White House. I think presidents are often talking to the portraits and expecting the portraits to talk back. Presidents dialogue with each other over the years about issues of race, about the role of government, about the country's place in the world. And this certainly is a speech filled with portent, and this may be one of those moments.
Wonder, too, about walking that fine line of tone, gravity of the situation economically in this country, but also the optimism that presidents must project.
Well, it's really true that on the one hand, a president wants to tell the story and tell the truth to the public. but also to convey confidence. And those are the things we remember from inaugural addresses. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Action now. Now, what people remember about Roosevelt's speech, his first speech in 1933, is that the lines that drew the greatest applause were not the polished rhetoric that we might remember now, but when he pledged action and even pledged to take dictatorial power if Congress wouldn't pass his economic plan. I don't think we're going to hear quite that, but this is not only words to be chiseled on the marble walls of the Obama Presidential Library. In a way, it's a political speech, too. It's got to give some momentum to his program.
Talking to Michael Waldman, who was the director of speechwriting for Bill Clinton from 1995 to 1999. But as we talk to him, we see three former vice presidents and their wives coming in, having been introduced. Walter Mondale, and then Dan Quayle, who's gotten some gray hairs since he was in Washington, and Al Gore. And you wonder what must be going through his mind, because had he gotten a second term, had he been elected president in the first place in the year 2000, and then gotten a second term, he would be there as the outgoing president of the United States. So close. We all remember the long election of the year 2000. Diane, I think we were on the air every day talking about the latest turns and twists on Good Morning America. George, that went on for months.
More than 30 days, and of course that inauguration day on January 20th was a very different time because we had that feeling, bitterness still lingering a little bit.
The color guard representing all of the services.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated.
Yeah, that is the Vice President-elect's mother coming in, and there is George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush.
Former President Bush has had hip trouble. But
Well, there's Mrs. Biden,
again.
up Jean Biden, right? There's Mrs. Biden. She's up out of the
92 years old.
Out of the chair.
92 years old, and who can forget? At the convention, he told the story of how she cheered him on.
And as he would tell the story, they kept taking pictures of her, and you could hear her saying, "That's right, that's right, yes, that's correct."
Yes, I did.
Yes, I did.
So you got a railing on there. Where we go?
And I had a chance to talk to the President Bush, just the day after his mother had gone for that hernia operation, and he was talking about how concerned his dad was. His dad was just totally distraught over the fact that Barbara Bush was having that operation. There you see Jimmy Carter, Rosalind Carter coming in, and there was that extraordinary lunch a couple of weeks ago where President Bush invited his dad, President Clinton, President Carter, and President-elect Obama to the White House to see 5 presidents, 3 former, 1 current, 1 future, standing together in the Oval Office. It was an extraordinary picture.
And President-elect Obama said he got a lot out of it, a lot out of that lunch with the former presidents, especially advice about how to make sure you get the right information, how to make sure that you test what your staff is telling you, and about how to manage your time as well. I mean, obviously, it is the most exclusive club in the world.
And presidential historian Richard Norton Smith with us, as he will be throughout the day. And Richard, I know you had a chance to talk. It was really the last item on the president's schedule. You had a chance to talk to President Bush 43 and President Bush 41 together at the White House yesterday. And I gather 43 was talking about what he needs from former presidents. There's Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton obviously coming in. This is coming through the crypt at the bottom of the Capitol, and then you funnel out from there out to the West Front. Anyway, Richard, I was just saying, I gather you had a chance to talk to the current president about what you really can get from former presidents.
Well, it's interesting. It was fascinating to see the two of them together and the love and the respect that each feels for the other. And it was in that context all the more poignant when the current President Bush said, you know, what you really want in a time of crisis from a former president is not counsel, but consolation. You know, the unique consolation that only someone who's been there can provide. And clearly, I think, much more often than perhaps we or journalists have known over these last 8 years, that the first President Bush has in fact been there to provide that kind of consolation.
And George H.W. Bush there, president, 41st president of the United States, hobbling a little bit. He's got a bad hip, and that's the reason for the cane and the walk. And there he is embracing President Clinton, and they have come to have such an extraordinary relationship in the post-presidency period. They have been sent on missions by the current President Bush together, and they're a little bit, when they're together, they're a little bit like the Odd Couple, like Felix and Oscar. I mean,
they love to laugh.
I thought you were going to say they get a little goofy. They do.
They do.
But Georgia can't help but look at former Senator, now Secretary of State designate Hillary Clinton's face and think, in a way, this is also the end of that long campaign of 2 years as she begins the new role. What is she
on the new
thinking?
team? Absolutely. Of course, she is sitting today as a former First Lady, though. There's Rahm Emanuel, the incoming Chief of Staff. Of course, he also worked for President Clinton. He had to be persuaded.
Well, that was one of the more indelicate moments that we'll see during this inauguration.
He's going to get an email about that one.
There are scripted moments in all of this, and there are unscripted moments, and that was one of the more candid.
We have to find out who
was on the other side of that.
Well, with Rahm, it could have been a number of people.
You know, in both those cases, both Senator Clinton and Rahm Emanuel, the president-elect had to convince them to take the jobs. And he wouldn't, even though they were both reluctant at first, he wouldn't give up, and he got them both on his team.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter and Mrs. Rosalind Carter.
They are running a bit behind schedule in all this, and I mention that only because there is considerable debate among constitutional scholars about when actually power transfers from one to the other. The Constitution designates the oath of office and requires that oath of office to be given 35 words to the incoming president. But then there's the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which designates that power transfers at noon. At 12 o'clock Eastern Time, Barack Obama becomes president and George Bush cedes the presidency. And at that exact moment, there's no nanosecond in between, they become president. And some people have argued, well, what if he doesn't take the oath until afternoon? Who is president in that interim? And constitutional scholars debate this. Luckily, it has been simply a sort of an academic debate up to this point because it hasn't been a problem. But
one thing's for sure, we know that at noon, George Bush is no longer president. There's a bit of a debate over who's the president if he
has not yet taken the oath, yes. But the constitutional scholars I've been reading in recent days say indeed noon transfers power whether or not the oath has been taken. I'll probably get emails from people who disagree with me about this, but I'm simply citing constitutional scholars at Yale. You may have some at Harvard that you want to use to disagree, but it's an interesting debate. John Lewis there, the congressman from Georgia, and I remember talking to him on election night, so eloquent about this meeting. He, John Lewis, who went through all the travails of the civil rights movement, was himself beaten during that time in the South, and now a member of Congress from Georgia, and somebody who, in his remarks on election night, so eloquently talked about what this means for Black America.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 42nd President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton, and Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton.
We sit on the who's going to replace Senator Clinton as the next senator from New York. Governor David Patterson says he might wait till the end of the week.
Coming out of Super Tuesday, she had the delegate lead.
Thank you very much. And it's a measure of her through this entire transition. You have never seen her face say what might have been.
Yeah. It's extraordinary. She won the primaries in New York, in California, in Texas, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania. And yet, the Barack Obama campaign, realizing it was a 50-state campaign, realizing that there were so many critical caucus states and small primary states, really outmaneuvered the Clinton campaign. You saw the Bush daughters coming in a few moments ago, and there are the moving trucks behind the White House as this goes on at the Capitol down at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. The moving boxes, the Obama possessions coming into the White House. The Bushes had mostly moved their stuff out of the White House prior to today, and there was just one chest of drawers apparently left that belonged to President Bush's grandmother that were still, the chest still in the White House to be moved out today. But most of the Bush furniture was gone, and the Obama furniture coming in now.
And as sad as it must be for them to leave the White House today, it's been my impression watching both of them over the last couple of weeks that they actually can't wait for their new life. They're ready for their new life and a return to private life.
Yes, although I'm curious to see how they'll balance their time between the ranch in Crawford and this new house in Dallas that they have
Ask
bought.
Laura.
Ask Mrs. Bush. The outgoing president, President Bush, will fly to Midland, Texas today. There'll be a ceremony there in Midland, in Ceremonial Square, I believe it is. And it was there that he left for Washington, from Midland, that he left for Washington.
President-elect Captain Beau Biden, Hunter Biden, and Ashley Biden, accompanied by House Chief Administrative
Here come
Officer
Sasha and Malia and their grandmother, headed for the podium. With brand new coats, I'll bet.
It also looked like Malia's going to be texting during the ceremony. She's got something in her hand there.
But I mentioned that he's going to go back to Midland, Texas, and then to Crawford later in the day, and they're going to stay at the ranch. But Laura Bush said, we'll be there for just a couple of days, and then we're